There are a lot of things that we avoid because, we're afraid that they'll make us feel lonely. And sometimes they're just simply outside of our comfort zone. And for me, one of those things was going to a sit down restaurant by myself here very recently. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know that, I've talked about divorce, difficult relationships, rebuilding life after 50, dating again, loneliness, life collapsing, all of it. So it probably sounds a little bit ridiculous that a guy who's been through all of that was nervous about eating pasta by himself. But I was, not terrified, not panic stricken, just uncomfortable enough that I almost talked myself out of going. Again, not because I couldn't afford it and not because I didn't have time. I had all the time in the world. But I almost didn't go because I thought I would feel out of place, you know. But then I went anyway. And by the time I walked out, I realized something. I was wrong, completely wrong. But not for the reason that I expected I would be. When I was married, restaurants were something that you did together, And when I was dating, restaurants were also something that, you did together. And if, friends wanted to get together, of course we'd meet somewhere and grab dinner. But for most of my life, sitting down in a restaurant was connected to other people. So after becoming single, I found myself doing what I think a lot of people do. Just grab takeout or eat at home. Or in my case, a lot of times it's, I'll go to one of my comfortable haunts. And that's a couple of local sports bar restaurants where nobody gives a damn if I'm sitting there alone or if I'm wearing a clown outfit, for God's sakes. They don't care. The food is good. The staff knows me. Nobody's judging anybody there. And it's kind of like the old show Cheers. I'm basically old Norm at this point. Boy, that's kind of uncomfortable. But anyways, even though I'm not much of a drinker at this age, those are still my haunts. You walk in, people know your name. You know what you're ordering before you even sit down. And the staff recognizes you. Everything just feels comfortable. And there's definitely something nice about that. But, the Olive Garden isn't one of those places. For whatever reason, that just felt different. So, if I'm being honest, I don't think this is really about the Olive Garden. I think the Olive Garden just happened to be, the thing this time. This time. There's many other examples. Because when your life changes, especially after a divorce or loss or starting over, you just quietly stop doing things. And it's not because you can't. You know, it's just because they don't feel the same anymore. Or you don't think they do. Or will. Don't think they will. Maybe it's a concert. Maybe it's a movie. Maybe it's a vacation. Maybe it's a weekend road trip. Maybe it's just simply this, trying a new restaurant. Maybe it's that thing that you've wanted to do for years. And then somewhere along the way, you start telling yourself a story. You know, I'll do it later. I'll do it when life settles down. I'll do it when, I meet somebody. I'll do it when I have somebody to go with. But if we're being honest, sometimes the real reason is fear. Fear of looking out of place. Fear of being judged. Fear of feeling awkward. Fear of being the only person there by yourself. And I think a lot of us know exactly what that feels like. Or we think we know what it's going to feel like. The funny thing is, we also convince ourselves that Other people are bringing all the value to the experience. They're not. Like somehow the concert isn't worth hearing alone. The beach isn't worth seeing alone. The trip isn't worth taking alone. You know, and the restaurant isn't worth trying alone. Experiences can absolutely be better when they're shared. There's no denying that. But sometimes we give away all the credit. Sometimes we act like we can't enjoy life unless somebody else is sitting right beside us. And I think that's exactly where I was. So I walked in, and normal. The hostess sat me down, and the waiter came over. And within about 10 minutes, I started to realize something. Nobody cared. Not one person. Nobody was staring at me. Nobody was whispering about the guy eating pasta by himself. Nobody was wondering what terrible life decisions, had led me to unlimited breadsticks alone on a Thursday night. Everybody was busy living their own lives. Just imagine that. The waiter treated me exactly the same. The food tasted exactly the same. And the world just kept spinning. And honestly, I was enjoying myself way more than I expected because something happened that normally doesn't happen when you're sitting across from another person. I started actually paying attention. I wasn't focused on carrying a conversation. I wasn't worried about, whether the other person was having a good time. I wasn't distracted at all. I was just sitting there observing, watching the world go by, watching life happen around me. And I started to notice things. There was a younger couple. And when I say younger, I don't mean they were young, I just mean they were younger. And they looked like they were probably on a first date. Now, maybe they weren't, but that's sure what it looked like. You could see the nervousness in them. You could tell they were trying to figure out what to say, trying to make good impression and trying to decide, whether there would even be a second date. Ultimately that's exactly what was happening. And that actually made me smile because if you've ever dated later in life, that feeling never completely goes away. You can be 25, you can be 55. A first date is still a first date, period. And watching them actually made me think about dating. Because the one thing that I've realized over the past few years is that I'm not looking for, perfection anymore. And I don't think that most people over 50 are. We're looking for connection. We're looking for peace. We're looking for someone, that we genuinely enjoy being around. And sitting there, watching those two nervous people trying to figure each other out, I actually found myself rooting for them, and even thinking, you know, maybe you should say this, maybe you should say that. And then I thought, but anyways, because, maybe that's what everybody's looking for. Not somebody to sit across from, somebody to actually connect with. But then there were families, groups of friends, people celebrating birthdays. Well, not people, one guy. People laughing, people telling stories, just people being people. And I noticed one couple, and not because they were arguing, and not because they looked unhappy, or not because they were causing a scene. They weren't doing any of that. But actually, what caught my attention was just how normal they looked. Just another couple sitting across from each other having dinner. Except for this, they barely spoke. The entire meal. Both of them were completely absorbed in their phones. Waiting on food, looking at phones. Food arrives, looking at phones. Eating, looking at phones. A few words here, a few words there, back to the phones. And I remember sitting there thinking, man, why even come out to do that? Seriously, why spend the money? Why drive here? And why would you wait for a table? Why sit across? Excuse me, folks, the pollen is killing me. Why sit across from another human being if neither of you is actually present? You could just stay home. Heat up a TV dinner. Maybe even sit in separate rooms and have pretty much the same exact experience. Now, before somebody thinks this is a video about phones, it's not. I use technology every day, and the phones aren't the point. The phones just happen to expose something. Because the longer I sat there, the more I realized what I was looking at wasn't technology. It was disconnection. And that's when something hit me. Before I walked into that restaurant, I thought I was going to be the lonely one. And, after all, I was the only person sitting there by myself. If you would have asked me beforehand who looked lonelier, I would have pointed at me without hesitation. But sitting there watching that couple, I wasn't so sure anymore. Because, they weren't fighting, they weren't arguing, they weren't obviously unhappy. But they just weren't connected. And maybe that's why it stuck with me. Because it looked normal. And that's the part that bothered me. It looked completely normal. We've gotten so used to seeing people physically together, but mentally somewhere else, that most of us don't even notice it anymore. And sitting there by myself, I realized something else. I wasn't, wishing I had somebody sitting across from me. I was actually enjoying my meal, enjoying my evening and enjoying the experience. The thing I thought would make me feel out of place didn't. But watching two people sit together without really being together, well, that stayed with me. And maybe it's because I've experienced that before. Maybe some of you have too. And maybe that's why I drove home thinking about it. Not because I had dinner alone, but because I walked in believing alone was the problem. And walking out, realizing disconnection is a whole different thing. And maybe, for me, that's the real lesson. Not that being alone is easy. And not that we should stop wanting connection. I mean, that's ridiculous. But that life doesn't start again when another person shows up. Maybe life actually starts again, the moment that we stop waiting for permission to live it. And that was a pretty unexpected thing to learn over a plate of pasta and way too many breadsticks.